By the beginning of June 1943, the first 5 boats, small submarine hunters, went on transports on a long journey across the Atlantic. Unfortunately, we were not able to get the remaining 14 boats. The Maritime Ministry took them for their own needs. However, on May 28th, at the shipyard in Miami, 20 such boats were laid down under the Soviet order, with improvements in armament recommended by us. We proposed to send them to Vladivostok without waiting for the next convoy across the Atlantic. In the first days of June VI, Minakov called me to Tampa. Here the shipyard was building AM-type minesweepers for the USSR. There were already Soviet crews for these ships. During the inspection of the progress of construction and training of our personnel VI, Minakov informed me that the Maritime Ministry agreed to give us 12 big hunters. The news was pleasant. After all, small hunters in the harsh conditions of the Barents Sea could be used only to a limited extent. There were no personnel for the big hunters, and Rear Admiral M.I. Akulin decided to staff their crews at the expense of minesweepers. It was necessary to organize the acceptance of minesweepers and big hunters in such a way as to ensure their transfer from the USA to the Soviet polar region in groups of 3 minesweepers and 3 hunters each. We were to receive the hunters in Miami, in the training center of submarine fighters. M.I. Akulin appointed me commander of the squadron of large submarine hunters transferred to the USSR. Without wasting time, I went to Miami and without much difficulty agreed on the training of Soviet crews with the head of the training center, Commander Eugene McDaniel. The formation of the squadron's crews began immediately. The first officers who came at my disposal were Chistiakov, Kuptsov, Sinelnikov, Loyubchenko, Ochasov, Demidov, Reshaitov, Taidenkov, Amiv, Fomichev, Kursky, Maximviv and Kozharin, with whom I had become acquainted during the long journey from Moscow to Washington. A year and a half of war experience in the Northern Fleet, where they almost all commanded small Mo 4 hunters, gave me confidence that the mastering of American ships would be a success. M.N. Samoylov was appointed mechanic of the detachment, engineer captain of the 3rd rank T.N. Banin arrived in my subordination for acceptance of the ships. Under his leadership, a special group was formed, which together with M.N. Samoylov included experienced petty officers Silin, Antipin, Abramov, Zairanov, Markelov, Mushenko and Lebedev. The choice of T.N. Banin turned out to be extremely successful. An excellent specialist, and if necessary a diplomat, Banin knew how to deal with the Americans. He would look at his opponent with a sly look and prove his rightness with knowledge. His whole stocky figure reeked of calmness and confidence. Acceptance of small submarine hunters, which were built now with the changes we proposed, but still without the installation of sonar, was engaged in P.A. favor of. On September 10th, we left Key West accompanied by an American big hunter of the same type as the Kashi. He was to lead the Soviet ships through the mine barriers. It was calm on the sea. I don't think I have ever wished so much for at least fresh weather. When, having rounded the Florida Peninsula, the ships turned north, the weather finally began to change. The wind picked up and gradually turned into a brutal 9-point gale. The hunter accompanying us transmitted by radio that he could not stay at sea any longer and was leaving for the Charleston base. And Soviet hunters and minesweepers continued the campaign. I did not leave the open bridge of the boat for hours. Above the huge, hiding the ships of the waves was a shroud of water dust. But the big hunter easily climbed the wave and, as sailors say, did not take on water. I could not but admire the endurance and excellent training of the boat crew and its commander, Senior Lieutenant Kuptsov, who skillfully managed his ship. This young officer had only once agreed to go down to the cabin for a couple of hours to change clothes and have a cup of coffee. The storm was already abating as our detachment approached the pier at Norfolk. After a short layover, we continued our trek and arrived safely in New York City on September 16th. Akulin received me immediately, and I, with good reason. The storm was a comprehensive test reported to the Admiral that the big hunters on the seaworthiness showed themselves no worse than minesweepers displacement of 900 tons, and this makes it possible with full consciousness of responsibility to declare the possibility of the transition of big hunters from the US to the USSR. Voyage in stormy conditions also showed that young commanders and their crews are ready for any difficulties, have physical endurance and skillfully manage technical means. I noted our motorists, who practically kept watch at the engines in tightly sealed engine compartments. At one of the moments of the storm, a huge wave raised the Hunter. On its crest, the exhaust pipes of the engine gases were exposed and, as mechanics say, seized the air. The engines stalled. The ship was carried by the wave right under the bow of the minesweepers coming alongside. Neither I nor the commander could do anything under such conditions. But a few languid seconds passed, and again we heard the murmur of engines. The motorists quickly managed to start them. Our Hunter took his place in the formation again. Agreeing with my conclusions, Rear Admiral Akulin sent a telegram to the Chief of the Navy headquarters in Moscow, which stated that Nikitin tested the seaworthiness of large Hunters in stormy conditions at the passage of Key West, New York, and believes that the boats can go across the Atlantic. In the reply telegram, signed by the Chief of the Navy Chief Staff, Vice Admiral Stepanov, it was reminded that in October in the Atlantic sailing conditions are extremely difficult, but ships of the big Hunters type are extremely necessary for the Soviet Navy. A decision had to be made, and Akulin gave an order to prepare the boats for transfer to the USSR. At the same time, he approved a number of my proposals on preparation for sailing in stormy Atlantic conditions, and in case of possible icing it was decided to remove the ventilation nozzles coming out of the bow compartment to the upper deck, and their necks were closed with metal covers and welded to place most of the ammunition from the cranes of the first shots of the bow cannon in the artillery cellar, to remove there the reactive depth bombs of the bow bombometer and a spare set of large depth bombs of the stern bombometers. In this way the bow of the Hunter was well sealed against ingress, water and everything possible was removed from the upper deck. Having followed in New York how the ships were carried out on the instructions for preparation for the transition, I returned to Miami. First of all, had to solve the question of staffing the crews of the 3 big Hunters, which remained to be accepted under the program of 1943. But thinking about how the transition of the first 2 groups did not give rest, at the end of September they went on the route St. John Reykjavik Londonry. The third group, which was preparing to go to Miami, also 3 Hunters and 3 minesweepers managed to staff, although incomplete crews. But for the 3 remaining Hunters we had only 12 petty officers and sailors. There was no time to wait for replenishment from the USSR. McDaniel said that the Maritime Ministry would take the boats for the US Navy if there were no Soviet crews on them within a week. What to do? I decided to transfer the 3 already accepted big Hunters to Tampa, where there were 3 of our minesweepers, and part of the people from them to return to Miami to staff the last 3 boats and raise the Soviet flag on them. Commander McDaniel saw our maneuver perfectly well, but pretended that everything is okay and goes as it should. A few days and the last 3 boats from the program of 1943 under the Soviet Navy flag. The work scheduled for this year on the acceptance of 20 small Hunters at the John Trumpy shipyard was also successfully completed. Between August 24th and October 5th, in groups of 3 or 4 boats, American crews transferred them by sea from Tampa to New Orleans. From there they moved by their own steam to the Panama Canal Zone to the port of Colon. Here the Mo-1s, as they became known in our fleet, were loaded onto transports and delivered to San Francisco. P.A. Favorov, whom I sent to San Francisco to follow the shipment of small Hunters to Vladivostok, inspected the condition of the boats after transportation from Colon. It turned out that the boats were in good condition, although it would be good to carry out some necessary measures before shipment to the Soviet Union. Pyotr Alexievich, a competent officer, charming and witty man, managed to enlist the help of Lieutenant Commander M. Carlson, commander of the boat's base in San Francisco, an experienced naval officer. The property of all Mo-1s was thoroughly inspected, and the missing property was obtained and placed on the gunboats. Favorov even managed to get the propellers, which showed signs of erosion, replaced. In mid-October, I transferred to New York the 3rd group of ships, received again 3 minesweepers and 3 Hunters. From Key West we left on October 10th. The squadron was commanded by the commander of the minesweeper, Lieutenant Captain A. M. Sovolovich's ship was the lead ship. The boat of Senior Lieutenant N. I. Demidov headed the keel column of big hunters. Two other big hunters were commanded by senior lieutenants Sinelnikov and Reshetov. NN Samoylov and I and my closest assistant on acceptance of ships M. Samoylov were on the lead hunter. Weather conditions on this passage were not better than in those days when I transferred the second group to New York. Even at the exit from the Gulf of Mexico, the wind reached the strength of 8 points, and this is called very strong wind according to the Beaufort scale. But the squad moved forward, riding the wave. The commanders, despite the strong excitement, kept their place in the line. M.N. Samoylov repeatedly checked how motorists Panin, Balabanov, Bugrov and Butorin and their petty officer F.Z. Sokolov were keeping watch, and each time he reported to me that people were working perfectly, above all praise. Sailors and petty officers of the upper watch helmsmen, signalmen, commanders were impeccable. Returning to my home in Miami, I stopped in Washington and reported to Akulin on the fulfillment of the plan of acceptance of ships for the past year, providing a detailed report on our work. In this report T.N. Banin and M.M. End. Samoylov took a very active part in compiling it. Lists of defects revealed during acceptance were given, and proposals were made for their elimination in the future. I also proposed to make some changes in the organization of boat acceptance in order to ensure better inspection of all mechanisms and devices, as well as boats in general. I also reported that thanks to the tireless work of our officers and petty officers, and first of all T.N. Banin and M.N.M. Samoylov, the personnel during the acceptance period have time to be well prepared for the operation of technical means, learn to eliminate malfunctions and fight for survivability. The Admiral positively evaluated our work and said that in the future, 44th year, the volume of deliveries of American ships to the USSR will increase several times. We will receive 34 large hunters. John Trumpy's firm will build for us small hunters at its shipyards in Miami and Comden, Annapolis Yacht Yard and Hershoff in Bristol torpedo boats of the Vosper type. We will also receive torpedo boats of the Higgins type. In mid-November, I took part in the 12-day passage of 6 torpedo boats of the Higgins type from New Orleans to New York. They were transferred by American crews under the command of Lieutenant Dressling, and I wanted to see how the boats would behave in the ocean. At the airfield in New Orleans, I was met by N.Y. Dolgonenko, the Soviet representative at the local shipyard of the Higgins firm. We immediately went to the shipyard. Along with torpedo boats, small landing boats were built here for the American Navy. All boats, both torpedo boats and landing boats, were assembled from prefabricated elements. The construction of the boats was perfected, one could say to perfection. All units, mechanisms, systems right down to the electrical wiring were assembled on the conveyor belt. Outside the shop gate, the bots were cut into sections. These sections were transported to naval bases in the South Pacific. There they were welded together again, and the bots were delivered to the fleet's landing formations. Before leaving, torpedo boats from New Orleans was still a few days, and I decided to go to the training center for anti-aircraft gunners in Shell Beach to negotiate the training of artillerymen of our crews. The command of the center, without much discussion, agreed to accept our sailors, and I was once again convinced that in the American Navy on the spot all issues are solved more easily than in the top. With interest, I got acquainted with the method of teaching anti-aircraft firing from automatic rifles and machine guns, inspected the artillery and machine gun installations located along the shore, at the water's edge. As I watched, a tow plane with a target cone passed along the line of anti-aircraft guns, and the artillerymen took turns firing. I noticed that each installation was firing shells with a track color assigned to it: green, red, orange. In the target shells, when hitting, leave a colored trace, and thus the assessment of the results of firing is not very difficult. But before allowing the calculations to fire, the training center checked the preparedness of artillerymen and machine gunners on special simulators. I paid attention to the simulator for machine gunners. It consisted of a movie screen on which one could watch the path of bullets relative to the target, and a digital unit that counted points for hitting the target. Both this and other simulators made extensive use of the principles of slot machines, which were already common in the United States at that time. From Shell Beach, I returned to New Orleans again. Having inspected the boats before crossing, I found considerable erosion of the propellers. But the American officer who received the boats at the factory only shrugged his shoulders. Capt. Nikitin, it is easier and cheaper to replace the propellers from time to time than to find ways to eliminate cavitation. You will do the same. I'll point out that we didn't do the same. Our boats have taken effective measures to eliminate propeller erosion. The journey from New Orleans to New York, 1,250 miles, took 12 days. The boats made transitions only during the daytime, and at night they stayed at naval bases on the Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic coast in Pensacola, Tampa, Key West, Miami, Mayport, Moorhead, Norfolk, and Cape May. There were times when the weather was calm, and there were days with swells up to 6 points. This trip remained in my memory also because the boats part of the way almost to Norfolk went on the rivers, lakes and canals of South and North Carolina. On the banks of the canals, as well as along the roads, now and then there were gas stations. In addition to fuel, you can get there the necessary spare parts, up to new motors and propellers. You can always get refreshment while sailing along the canals in the snack bars located on the banks. The traffic of small boats on the inland waterways was quite intense, and there were barges pulled by horses running along the canal. In addition, it was interesting to pass by the battle sites of northern and southern ships during the American Civil War. Back in college, I read about the actions of a squadron of Northerners under the command of Commodore Farragut near New Orleans, about the battles between the world's first battleships Merrimac, and Monitor, about the battle at Mobile Raid, when the monitors of the Northerners forced to surrender the battleship of the Southerners Tennessee. Unfortunately, the officers of the American torpedo boats, most of them enlisted from the reserves, knew their country's history, and especially naval history, poorly. They were quite surprised by my story that the widespread use of mine weapons on the sea and rivers was based in the fleets of both North and South on the combat experience of Russian sailors in the Crimean War. The crossing showed that the Higgins had good seaworthiness. Therefore, I was able to confidently report to Akulin that the boats are capable of operating in the Soviet polar regions. At the same time, it became known that the first 3 groups of ships we received safely came to the Northern Fleet. Many years later, the former commander of the Big Hunter N.I. Demidov, who participated in the passage of the 3rd group of our ships, wrote to me the first storm caught us, as you know, still on the passage of Key West, Norfolk. But it was flowers in comparison with what awaited us ahead. We left St. John's on November 1st. A day later, the wind began to strengthen and reached 9 points from the north. We had to reduce the course to 6 knots. On November 3rd and 4, we continued to storm. The height of the wave exceeded 8 meters and was 150 meters long. The boats were strongly beaten when they, going down the reverse slope of the wave, reached its bottom. We had to apply such a maneuver to go down the reverse slope lag, respectively turning the boat, and when reaching the bottom of the wave again, put the boat to meet it. For such work on the rudder, a man had enough strength for 10 to 15 minutes, after which a change was required. The fuel was running out. Its stock, taken on deck in barrels, was washed overboard. When the storm waned, the boats began to take fuel from the minesweepers on the quicksand, which reached 5 or 6 points. Dredges from 250mm rope, designed for towing, and buckstovi from the minesweepers to the boats were torn every now and then, like threads. It is not difficult to imagine what difficulty and danger this fuel reception was. The boats, being 10 to 15 meters behind the stern of the minesweepers, then flew up on the crest of the wave several meters above the minesweepers' decks, then fell somewhere down. But everything turned out safely, and on November 8th our group arrived to Kovel Fjord, having spent 7 days for the passage instead of the planned 4. I should add that in one of the stormy nights we were fired at by the ships of the convoy coming from England to the USA. After all, the Americans removed radars and radar identification equipment from our boats and minesweepers. Therefore, the ships of the convoy could well take us for the enemy. Fortunately, everything went well. On November 16th, 1943, our detachment joined the Allied convoy and went out together with it to Murmansk. The passage to the Kola Bay, which took 8 days, took place in no less difficult conditions. As you know, there was no one to replace the boat commanders, and they did not leave their bridges all the way to November 24th. It is impossible to speak about this remarkable passage without feeling proud of our officers, petty officers and sailors, small ships with incomplete crews, displacement of only 126 tons, having overcome winter storms of the Atlantic and Barents Sea, came home and joined the glorious Northern Fleet. The personnel of the boats, their commanders Borodavko, Chistyakov, Tidenkov, Ermiev, Kuptsov, Okasov, Demidov, Lyubchenko, Sinelnikov, Reshetov, Maximov and Kozharin made a real feat, showed courage and military skill. As usual, I returned from Washington to Miami by train. Familiar landscapes of the southern states were passing outside the window, but I did not care about the beauty of nature. I was mentally planning the next days of work. There was a lot to do. It was necessary to organize acceptance of boats in new points, and there were not enough people for that. Therefore, in Miami, I was very happy to hear about the replenishment that arrived from the USSR. These were commanders of torpedo boats Tkachenko, Maslov, Krasovsky and Nikolaev, and small hunters of Mo-4 type Sagulenko, Kizelev and Shchukin, engineer Senin, military technicians Cherny and Demin, petty officers motorists Lebedev, Melnikov, all from the Pacific Fleet. The group, which arrived on November 24th, appeared in Miami unexpectedly. For some reason it was not known even in our Naval Department in Washington. My wife had to take on the duties of Mother Commander and provide the arrivals with some money, mobilize, and very modest funds of the families of T.N. Banin and P.A. Favorov, but it was impossible to use for the reception of people from the group of MG. Malik, it was necessary to organize their training in the training centers of the American fleet. In the first days of December from the Soviet Union arrived and long-awaited crews of minesweepers and big hunters. We were able to staff the last group of ships of the 1943 program, 3 minesweepers and 3 big hunters, and leave some people in reserve for the ships that were to take in the coming 44th. On December 23rd, the last group of minesweepers and hunters left Key West. Already on New Year's Eve I went to sea to receive another small hunter launched in Tampa. We met the new year in Miami, in the circle of our own. Soviet officers and our families gathered. We raised our glasses to the motherland, to the victory of the Red Army and Red Fleet, to the fact that finally the second front was opened in the coming year. In the first days of January of the 44th, by the joint order of the Commissars of Navy and Foreign Trade, a brigade of big hunters was created. I was appointed commander of it, having also assigned responsibility for the training of commanders and petty officers of torpedo boats and acceptance of all ships transferred to the USSR in the States. Training of crews and acceptance of large hunters and minesweepers in general had already been established. Therefore, first of all, I was engaged in organizing the training of commanders and petty officers of torpedo boats. However, the attempts of our representatives in Washington to agree on this issue with representatives of the Maritime Ministry did not yield results. Then I decided to go to Melville myself, where there was a training center for torpedo boat crews. I did not want to go by train, and I willingly accepted the offer of the interpreter assigned to me, an officer of the U.S. Navy K. Peterson, to make a trip in his Ford. After all, we had to cross almost the entire country from south to north. For the first, and maybe for the last time, I had the opportunity to see the life of the American backwoods. Lieutenant Peterson, a cheerful young man, spoke Russian perfectly. His father, a collapsed Swede, formerly a major timber merchant in the Russian Far East and Siberia, had emigrated with his family to the United States in the early 20s. It must be said that Peterson treated his duties faithfully. I cannot say that about another American liaison officer and interpreter, Lieutenant A., who appeared in our brigade a little later. Under the mask of outward deference, this man concealed his enmity to the Soviet people, to our country. He tried by any means to complicate the solution of cases that fell into his charge, and for the most insignificant reason he referred to the need to request Washington. More than once I had to resort to the help of Commander McDaniel to stop his sabotage, by the ill-concealed dislike with which he was regarded by McDaniel, a gentleman in the full sense of the word, and by other American officers. It was felt that A. was working mainly for another, not the Navy Department. This man even managed to send to the new duty station interpreters Lieutenant Peterson and non-commissioned officer Gagarin, with whom we had good business relations. However, after our protest again with the help of McDaniel, they were returned. We had another Russian interpreter, One day, an American officer came to see me and introduced himself as a reserve lieutenant, Yuri Petrovich Heiksinen. It was noticeable that he was very excited. After an awkward pause, Heiksinen said that he was a former White Guard from the Tsar's Marine Corps. I did not react in any way to this statement, and the lieutenant became completely embarrassed. Finally, Heiksinen said that his past did not allow him to fulfill the duties of an interpreter, no matter how conscientiously he performed them. The Soviet sailors would not trust him. At the same time, he is a Russian, and a patriot loves Russia, and is on the side of its people, and the heroic Russian army with all his heart. I calmed the lieutenant, tried to convince him that now it was not about the past, but about honest joint work. I must say that the experience of further cooperation in bases on the east coast of the States and then in Alaska showed that Heiksinen spoke the truth. He worked very well. In the US, I repeatedly had to meet with representatives of the Russian emigration. Its composition was very heterogeneous. Emigrants from Russia who had settled in the States before the First World War left their homeland in search of a way out of abject poverty. Most of them were peasants from the western regions of Belarusia and Ukraine, and poor Jews from settled areas, to whom America seemed to be the promised land. Joining the army of American laborers, they were subjected to even more brutal exploitation than the workers who emigrated from Western Europe. We often met during our stay in the United States their descendants who served in the Army and Navy, worked in factories, mills and farms. As a rule, these people showed sincere interest in the homeland of their fathers and grandfathers, were proud of our victories over the armies of Nazi Germany, and were always happy to help us in some way. For the most part, the second and third generations of this layer of emigration had already lost their native language, and at best could only explain themselves in a strange mixture of English and Russian-Ukrainian Belarusian. The other layer of emigration were those who found themselves in the States after the Great October Socialist Revolution and the Civil War. White officers and dispossessed landowners, factory owners, merchants and counter-revolutionary party leaders hated the land of Soviets. The wave of emigration also brought to the shores of America those who left their homeland due to various, often accidental circumstances: engineers and scientists, writers, artists and musicians. Well, thousands of Cossacks and soldiers, junior officers, were taken out of Crimea against their will or by deception. The life of white emigrants was different. Former members of the provisional government, landlords and capitalists who managed to take their capitals out of Russia settled down quite well, and Cossacks and soldiers who by fate found themselves in a foreign land became simple laborers and experienced all the charms of the American way of life: discrimination in civil rights and employment, sweatshop system of labor on the assembly lines of automobile factories giants. American firms willingly hired Russian engineers and scientists. However, all scientific discoveries and inventions became the property of the employer, and authorship was not retained. Only a few Russian emigrant engineers were able to make their way to the Olympus of American society to gain fame, to achieve material prosperity. Among them are prominent engineers Seversky and Sikorsky, who managed to create their own design bureaus, to become owners of firms. By the way, they hired mainly natives of Russia and Poland. It is interesting that the press and movies, advertising Seversky and Sikorsky, presented them as purist Americans, without a word mentioning that they successfully started their activities as aircraft designers in Russia. This appealed to the common man, meeting his perception of the United States as the home of all that is new and progressive. Once I accidentally got to a movie about Seversky Americans were proud of the designer of flying fortresses, the most powerful bombers of the Second World War era, and companies spared no money on advertising. From the frames of the picture, successively telling about the life of the father of American aviation, it followed that the hero, who lost his leg in an air battle in World War I, a natural-born American. But here is a photograph of a young man in the uniform of a midshipman of the Russian Navy. On the ribbon of his visor is the inscription, the Tsesazavich Alexei Marine Corps. The announcer at the same time says that Seversky graduated from the Naval Academy. Then on the screen appears a photo of Seversky in uniform, a Russian naval officer, against the background of a seaplane M1 designed by Grigorovich. And in the narrator's text, not a word about Seversky's participation in battles with the Germans in the Baltic. A similar myth was created in the US. and the engineer Sikorsky, designer of the world's first heavy bombers Ilya Muromets. During the First World War, they were built at the Baltic plant in Petrograd and made test flights from the Komendantsky airfield. Often Muromets at a low altitude passed over the maritime polygon, and we boys, with our heads up, looked at the huge airplanes of those times. After the attack of Hitler's Germany on the USSR, the Russian emigration to the United States was divided into two camps. Not unknown Kerensky and Countess Tolstaya did not change their anti-Soviet positions and led that part of the Russian emigration, which continued to be hostile to the USSR. Their press organ, the Black Hundred newspaper Russia, placed rehashes of Goebbels' propaganda, rejoiced at our failures, glossed over the victories of the Red Army. But most of the natives of Russia took a patriotic position, tried to help our country as much as they could. The Society Aid to Russians in the War, which appeared, it seems, in 1941, organized the collection and sending of medicines, food and clothes to the Soviet Union. The Society also advocated for the return of emigrants to the USSR, and in this connection it carried out a lot of explanatory work. Many decided to take this fundamental step and became Soviet citizens even before the end of the war. The Russian-language newspaper Russian Voice actively propagandized the successes of the Red Army, fought against misinformation and slander, which was abundant in the American press. On its pages I have repeatedly read objective, expertly written military reviews Kernakov. A lieutenant colonel in the Tsarist army, a participant in the Brusilov breakthrough, during the Civil War he became a White Guard, fought against the young Soviet Republic. But from the first day of the Great Patriotic War, the former chief of operations of the division headquarters of General Drostov declared his support for the just cause of the Soviet people. He not only cooperated in the Russian Voice, but also went on lecture tours around the country, calling for immediate aid to Soviet Russia, explaining the necessity of opening a second front in Europe as soon as possible. More than once I had to meet Colonel Kernakov and talk with him. His patriotic position was not the result of emotional impulse, but the fruit of long reflection and reassessment of the past. It is not without reason that Kernakov concluded his lectures with Lenin's words about the invincibility of the people who know what they are fighting for. Colonel Kernakov was not such a rare exception. Many White Guard officers underwent the same evolution. During one of my trips to New York, I attended a meeting of the Aid to Russians in the War Society and drank tea from a 3-bucket samovar with emigrants Putyatyn and Cherkassky. Cherkassky, a former Russian naval officer, was quite surprised when I told him that the textbook on naval practice, which he had written in the pre-revolutionary years, had been reprinted many times. I do not know what happened to these emigrants later, but during the war years they did a lot of useful things for their former homeland. Not everyone, of course, even then accepted the revolutionary changes that took place in Russia after the Great October Revolution. But in the face of a formidable danger to the very existence of the Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian and other peoples of the Soviet Union, knowing about Hitler's intentions to destroy Slavic culture, to raze its monuments to the ground, emigrants could not but realize that only the victory of the Red Army over the Wehrmacht and its allies can rid the lost homeland from the fascist yoke. Not without reason the New York branch of Helping Russians in the War, after the defeat of the Nazis at Stalingrad, issued a commemorative sign on the background of the shield bas-reliefs of a Russian soldier in an ancient helmet and a Red Army soldier in a steel helmet, and in the lower part of the commemorative dates 1242 to 1942. So, in the last days of January, Peter Sotz and I left Miami. Ford is rushing along the beautiful highway. We flashed advertisements calling to visit the Everglades, to admire the swamps with caimans, and to look at the real Seminoles. I am reminded of the novels of Mine Reid, the battered book one read many times as a child. Osceola, chief of the Seminoles, now the remnants of a proud and freedom-loving people, live in the reserve in an ornamental village. They are shown to tourists. The farther north, the more intense the traffic on the highway becomes. The evergreen lawns of Florida are replaced by the fields of Georgia. Soon enough, they'll be covered with sprouting cotton. The fields are usually small, interspersed with groves. Here and there you can see the unassuming houses of Negro farmers. From afar they seem abandoned, and only sacks of oranges for sale on the roadside indicate that they live here. Sometimes I manage to notice white two-story mansions with an invariable colonnade houses of white landowners, descendants of planters' slave owners, from whom Negroes rent land. The fields are deserted now, and how many people I saw in the fields at harvest time. All Negroes. Only once in a while you see a white man watching the work. Peterson drives the car perfectly, at a high speed, something like 60 miles an hour. He has time to talk about the places we pass, but he never takes his eyes off the road as it climbs up and down the hills. Indeed, it's impossible to yawn. The roads are magnificent, Level Peterson says. We don't slow down on the corners, left turn right side up, right turn left side up. Every 10 miles gas stations of various companies. Here you will not only fill up with gasoline, change oil, but also necessarily inspect the car preventive maintenance. After all, an American, as a rule, does not know the device of his car, does not know how to repair it. But he sits perfectly behind the wheel, knows all the rules of the road to the finest detail. However, the one who does not possess such skills will not drive for long. I was told that in the year before the war more people died in automobile accidents than the U.S. Armed forces lost in World War I. For a little rest and food we stop in small towns, so well described by I, Ilf and E. Petrov. They all look the same: a central street with 2 or 3 mini skyscrapers, 8 to 10 floors, which house a bank, a department store and the boards of local firms, a car store, boasting the latest models behind mirrored windows. There are also cafeterias, bars and drag stores. And around this centre, quiet streets, tree-lined plots with cottages. On the terraces, or even right outside, their owners sit in rocking chairs. But still, this is not the sleepy provincial world of the era described in One Story America. In the townships there are branches of industrial firms, usually assembly plants. There's money being made everywhere. We grab a quick bite at cafeterias or drag shops. The food is monotonous but good, and the rooms are clean. Sometimes, seeing an unfamiliar uniform on me, the owner of a gas station or drug store asks who I am. The answer is always surprising. Our country is like another planet to a provincial American. But as a rule, he immediately expresses a wish for victory over the Huns. True, I once met an American of German descent who expressed indignation at the bombing of German cities and tried to prove that the USSR had attacked the Vaterland of his ancestors. I had to remind him of the ruins of Stalingrad and Coventry, of the well-known facts of history. It should be said that Americans of German descent make up a significant in number and influence layer in the population of the states. And although most loyally performed their civic duty, Hitler's agency recruited its cadres mainly from Germans. Our Ford has overcome almost halfway. We have crossed Georgia, North and South Carolina. We drive on the roads of Virginia. We've got a lot of impressions. It seems that even here, far away from large industrial centers, Americans do not experience any difficulties associated with the war, which the country has been waging for 3 years. I ask what Peterson thinks about it. The lieutenant thinks I'm wrong. Surprised at my words, of course, there are difficulties and plenty of them. He talks about food cards, restrictions on gasoline and automobile rubber. Propaganda convinces the average American of the need for restrictions in every possible way, tells of the plight of Great Britain, of the war in the Pacific Islands. Every day the radio and newspapers urge the American to use his personal automobile only for trips to work, church and the theatre. Neighbours are advised to join together and take turns driving their cars to work, and if there is room to spare, to take hitchhikers. Newspapers and radio even claim that every unoccupied seat is tantamount to being occupied by Japanese Americans. As always and in everything, heed the urging of the press and radio the habit of advertising. And the patriotic upsurge is certainly having an effect. I remember that when we first arrived in Miami and did not have a car, we were regularly dropped off by Americans, people who were complete strangers. Once, on a trip from Miami to Tampa, the camera on my car burst. We were driving at night, at high speed, and during braking the tire turned into rags. It was good that the car was not wrecked, and we survived. The owner of the gas station, who was called by the owner of a passing car, had the tire, but he flatly refused to sell it without a certificate. We had to raise the mayor of a nearby town, despite the night, to get permission to buy the wheel. All these appeals to endure the difficulties were presented with the peculiar American propaganda love for cheap sensation and all sorts of hype. In the first days of our arrival in Washington from San Francisco, all the newspapers reported the patriotic act of the Russian ambassador, Mr. Maxim Litvinov, who went with his wife to the theater not by car, but by public transport. For several days, the New York newspapers savored the divorce proceedings, the reason for which was the unwillingness of the wife to tolerate excessive, in her opinion, her husband's love for steaks, which took the entire norm of beef on cards. Much attention was paid to disruptions in the coffee trade. Once, a movie theater in Washington, D.C., even showed such a scene before the show began. The lights went out in the hall, and on the stage flashed a beam of electric flashlight. A masked man armed to the teeth was sneaking to the safe. He looks around, takes out the lockpicks and opens the safe, hurriedly throws out of the safe thick stacks of dollars, some papers. What does he want? Finally, the thief finds what he's looking for: a coffee box. Ignoring the money scattered on the floor, he clutches it to his heart and escapes. In reality, however, Americans did not experience serious deprivation. For example, gasoline rationing was generally in line with needs and was hardly less than what the average American had consumed before the war. Cards for beef and sugar were introduced, but pork, poultry, veal and all sorts of sweets were sold without restrictions. And in restaurants, drag stores and cafeterias, you could order steaks in unlimited quantities and drink coffee. All this noise about the hardships experienced by the American people in the name of helping the Allies carried a very noticeable tinge of sanctimony and hypocrisy. It was unpleasant for a Soviet person to see and hear all this. We knew what hardships the war had brought to our motherland. I say something like that to Peterson, and he finally agrees with me. But Boris Viktorovich, he smiles, only because I am a Russian man. A real American would simply not understand you. The second day of the journey is coming to an end. It's time for a break. We take a motel room on the outskirts of a small Virginian town. Nearby is a cemetery where, as the owner says, our Yankees are buried who fell in battle during the Civil War. Richmond, Petersburg, Fredericksburg. There are many places in Virginia that have gone down in history as battlefields between the armies of the North and the South. Not all of them brought victory to the North, but in the end the Confederates were defeated. Negro slavery was abolished throughout the United States, but true freedom, equal rights, Negroes have not achieved to this day. I ask Peterson if he remembers the contribution of Russia, of the Russians, to the victory of the right-wing cause of the North. But the grammar school course of history is forgotten quite thoroughly. I remind him that he must have read Stanukovich's The Restless Admiral as a child. So Restless Admiral Popov, Rear Admiral, who commanded the Russian squadron in the Pacific Ocean in October 1863, brought it to San Francisco. Early the following year, the Russian squadron saved the defenseless city from an attack by Southern ships. The Northerners had no fleet in the Pacific. Great positive role, and the Russian Atlantic Squadron of Rear Admiral Lisovsky, which entered the port of New York in September 1863. These were difficult days for President Lincoln's government, with France and England making plans for intervention to support the rebellious Southerners. Peterson listens with great interest, and I think that in the US, is not very fond of remembering the contribution of other nations to their culture, science and technology, about the help that their country for a century and a half other countries, such as Russia and France, which did a lot for the victory of the former British colonies in the War of Independence. About the contribution of Russia to the victory of the North in the Civil War did not know, and American officers from torpedo boats, on which I made the transition from New Orleans to New York. Meanwhile, we pass Virginia and enter the Federal District of Washington. Our road trip is over. Having settled a number of current affairs in our purchasing committee, I leave by train with Peterson for Melville. The train crosses the first state of the North, industrial Pennsylvania, and the cozy New England townships appear outside the window. This is the land of the first English and Dutch settlers in North America. The state of Connecticut welcomes white, clean towns, maybe the most beautiful in the country. It seems that they remain as they were hundreds of years ago at the time of the heroes of the wonderful American writer Washington Irving. except that carriages have been replaced by automobiles, traffic is heavier, and the streets are paved. Maple trees lined the roads near the railroad line. Too bad they're leafless now, in winter. These must have been the trees from which Fenimore Cooper's heroes extracted the sweet syrup to make maple sugar. But here are the shores of Long Island Bay, the end of the journey, and yet a short rest. Time to get down to business. In Melville, everything went as well as possible. With the command of the Torpedo Boat Training Center, Lieutenant Commanders Walsh and Parker, combat boat officers who fought in the Philippines, and the Solomon Islands immediately found common ground, and after the conversation found out that I am a former commander of the torpedo boats and served on them for many years. They agreed to accept for training our commanders and petty officers from torpedo boats. Helped, and my knowledge of the actions of American torpedo boats in the U.S. Recently published books, Lieutenant Commander Bulkley, we were exhausted and long were the nights. I expressed my admiration for the combat deeds of American gunboats, and said that I had read Parker's articles in the magazine Yachting about the actions of torpedo boats at Midway Island and the Solomon Islands. Returning to Washington, I obtained Aculin's agreement to go to the Navy Department to make final arrangements for the training of our sailors at Melville. But Capt. Donald, with whom we met at the Operations Office of the Maritime Ministry, at first refused to allow our officers and petty officers to be sent to Melville, citing overloading of the training center. Then, as if by the way, I said that only from there and received the consent of the management. Without giving the impression that my words were a surprise to him, Donald promised to receive our group in February of the 44th year. By the way, during my stay in the US, I never once had to meet with a case of cancelling a decision made by a senior superior to his subordinate. The senior could advise the junior to cancel an order or change a decision, but he never did it himself honestly, not a bad rule. And again, a familiar route, I am returning from Washington to Miami by train. From the train station I stop at home for half an hour to change my clothes. Here, despite the winter, it is warm, about 20 degrees. In the brigade headquarters, immediately plunged into a sea of all sorts of things, listen to reports, give orders to Captain 3rd Rank M.G. Malik to prepare his personnel to leave for Melville in the training center, and so on. As always, P.A. Favourov is pleased with the clarity of the report and exhaustive completeness of information during my voyage to Melville and Washington. His group managed to receive 8 more small submarine hunters. Together with the boats that raised the Soviet flag in early January 1944, this is already 12 units. By agreement with our purchasing committee, we decided to complete the boats with crews and send them on their own to New York. A considerable part of the route, with the consent of the American commanders, the Mo-1 detachment will go by inland waterways, the Intracoastal Channel, which runs parallel to the shoreline of Long Bay from Port Royal near Charleston to Southport. If the weather deteriorates, the boats will immediately take shelter in ports, of which there are plenty along their route. On January 24th, a warm, windless day, the small hunters leave Miami. I decide to devote a day or two to deal with the mountains of papers sent to our headquarters from Washington, the head of the financial department of the Procurement Commission C. It is amazing how this man, hiding behind formally interpreted paragraphs of instructions, does not want to understand the needs of the compound and the peculiarities of American life. He is ready to fight for every cent and at the same time calmly writes off hundreds of dollars if such an expense is provided for in the instructions. Meanwhile, as we all soon realized, in the United States we should look closely at the system of services, the organization of all kinds of rental appliances and even cars. For example, we were allocated money for daily business trips. A taxi company would send a car at the appointed time. But cabs are expensive in the States. For 2 months, cab rides cost the procurement committee more than $500. And it turned out that quite decent Ford can be purchased for $600 to $700. With the help of our naval attach, we received $1,200 to buy a car. It is clear that it reduced our expenses and became convenient. We had our own car. We could use it at any time and choose the most rational routes when travelling. I had to solve another task, seemingly not peculiar to a naval officer. The fact is that the stay of women in labour in hospitals in the United States costs a lot of money. To pay the bills of the maternity hospitals, where the wives of Soviet citizens lay, the Procurement Commission allocated a special fund. But here the number of newborns exceeded the norm. We had to ask for an additional sum. We telegraphed to Moscow and received an immediate reply signed by Anastas Ivanovich Mikoyan, pay at the expense of any estimate. I should note that the bills were not insignificant. It was unusual for us, Soviet people, citizens of a country where all medical care is free. But now all the papers are sorted out. The numerous inquiries of the procurement committee have been answered. Now we have to decide what to do with the 2 big hunters, which are going to be delivered to us in early March by the Americans on account of 34 units of the 1944 program. Peterson told me that these 2 hunters have long been in use. Their mechanisms are badly worn out. The hulls are in such a state that it is necessary to carry out work to replace the decks. Of course, we don't need such boats. And it is dangerous to go across the Atlantic on them. I had to ask the Marine Department of the Procurement Commission to refuse these boats. At the same time I raised the question about the program of acceptance of ships from the American side. We needed the support of Soviet representatives in Washington, as the Americans intended to reduce the transfer of ships to a purely formal act. I wanted to make the acceptance in such a way that it was possible to make sure that all devices, mechanisms and weapons were in good working order. Looking ahead, I want to say that here we managed to win. The Maritime Ministry accepted the program of testing and preparation for the transition to the USSR, drawn up by the headquarters of the Soviet Brigade, which included the opening of mechanisms, trips to sea and docking. In the same days, the Americans finally decided to give us ships with radars. We immediately organized in the training center in Miami to study the basics of radar and material part of radar stations. The lectures of the American instructor were translated by Lieutenant Peterson. It seems that at the first lesson he smiled and added that radar was a Russian invention. A.S. Pushkin wrote about radar in his fairy tale The Golden Cockerel. I immediately continued that Pushkin may have foreseen the appearance of radar, but it was the Russian inventor Popov who discovered the phenomenon of radar at the end of the last century. This was news to both the American lecturer and the translator. On February 1st, 4 more Mo-1 boats left for New York by the same route as the previous group. Reporting this to Washington, I informed M. Akulin that, according to the information we had, the Americans wanted to stop further delivery of small hunters, as if they could not send them to the USSR. No convoys. I hoped that Mikhail Ivanovich would be able to negotiate with the appropriate officials in the Ministry of Marine. Akulin knew how to talk to the Americans calmly and businesslike, to joke in time. Thanks to his diplomatic tact, the Procurement Commission, as a rule, successfully overcame all sorts of obstacles. And those who wanted to create them to delay or even disrupt supplies to the USSR, there were, alas, enough. In preparation for the acceptance of 34 big hunters went strictly according to the plan we had outlined. Classes on studying radar began. We were waiting for our hydroacoustics in Key West. I had agreed with the head of the special school there to train Soviet sailors in a special school, Capt. Keating, who promised even training with submarines at sea at the final stage. The artillerymen agreed to be accepted for training at the Shell Beach Training Center. In the same days, Captain 3rd rank I. N. Gritzik and then I visited the shipyards in Elizabeth City, Jacksonville and Dayton Beach, where the big hunters intended for the USSR were being built. It remained to wait for the arrival of the crews. On January 20th, 1944, the last group of big hunters and minesweepers, received in December of the previous year, left Miami for the USSR. Its transition was headed by Captain 3rd rank M.N. Mole. The management of the Minesweeper Division, which was under construction in Tampa, fulfilled its task and was disbanded. Lieutenant Captain V.M. Kulakov and Captain 3rd rank E.A. Kamirov arrived at my disposal. Evgeny Alexeyevich, who headed the brigade headquarters, I knew from his service in the Office of Naval Forces of the Red Army in the 30s, as a skillful organizer, a smart staff worker. He showed himself well in his new position. In addition, Rear Admiral Akulin sent me 2 officers from the Procurement Commission engineer Captain Lieutenant A. M. Koklov and Technician Lieutenant N. A. Kuzmenko, who also joined the staff. The brigade headquarters prepared everything necessary for accelerated training of the crews, and the crews of 4 big hunters, which arrived on March 25th from the USSR, started training in a week. Now, when the combat training of crews was established, and before the start of acceptance of big hunters was still 2 or 3 weeks, I was able to fulfill my long-standing desire to properly familiarize myself with the shipyards where torpedo boats were built. I reported to M.I. Akulin about the state of affairs in the brigade and how engaged in the training center torpedo boat sailors Captain 3rd Rank Malik. Then I went to the factory of the firm Elco. The 2 days that I spent in New York at the Elco shipyard allowed me to study the organization and technology of production quite well, and from Mr. N, who was my guide, to learn a lot of interesting things about the history of the creation and construction of torpedo boats in the States. As it turned out, the Americans in this area of shipbuilding widely used the experience of the British and Italians, gained during the First World War. It seems that 2 years after the Peace of Versailles, the Maritime Ministry bought in England 2 torpedo boats of the type Thornycroft. But something in these boats Americans did not like, and from the construction of the series, as originally planned, refused. Before World War II, General MacArthur wanted to include in the defense system of the Philippines hundreds of torpedo boats. When the Navy Department announced a competition for the best torpedo boat design, Mr. Sotvan, president of Elco, went to England. He carefully studied all types of torpedo boats available there and bought from the firm Vosper license for a boat design Scott Payne. On its basis, engineers of the design bureau Elco developed their own project torpedo boat, somewhat different from its prototype. It was equipped with 3 engines Packard, created by the same name company also on the basis of the British prototype aircraft engine Rolls-Royce. Having received an order from the Maritime Ministry, Elco began construction of boats. After the beginning of World War II, the construction of torpedo boats in England stopped. Although they were very much needed by the Navy, strangely enough, the Vospri were equipped with motors supplied by an Italian company. Only since 1941 from the US began to arrive on Lend-Lease engines from the US, type Packard, and the British shipyards were able to resume the construction of Vopra. The necessary number of torpedo boats English industry to supply its fleet could not, and the right to build Viparov was gratuitously transferred to US firms in exchange for the obligation to deploy their construction for England. It so happened that at numerous shipyards in the US, Built and Elco and Vopers, slightly different from each other, as well as Higgins. But only the Elcos went into service with the US Navy. Why this is so, I quite frankly explained to me Mr. N. Shareholders of the company Elco consist of many admirals, and therefore it is easier for her to obtain an order of the Ministry of Maritime. A few months later, I received a clear confirmation of what Mr. N. said. The number of Viparov and Higgins, which we received under Lend-Lease, did not meet the needs of the Soviet Navy. Attempts to increase supplies did not yield positive results. And then it became known that the firm Elco, which had no right to sell the USSR ready-made boats, could bypass this prohibition and supply complete sets of parts of their hulls, mechanisms etc. in order to assemble the boats on our territory. In this case, the firm not only provided all the necessary technical documentation, but also undertook to send its shipbuilding specialists to the Soviet Union. We decided to ask the Americans to supply us with 50 kits for Elco boats. However, everything turned out to be not so simple. Our appeals to the Maritime Ministry and the Lend-Lease administration failed. Then the representative of Elco advised us to address one of the prominent heads of the Maritime Ministry, confidentially adding that he was a shareholder of their firm. The admiral, I will not mention his surname, took the most ardent part in our case, and the order was accepted as soon as possible. Quite soon, at one of the Leningrad factories with the participation of American specialists, we started assembling the Elco. Business is business. By the way, Lieutenant Commander Walter Rove, a representative of the fleet at the Elco shipyard, told me another characteristic episode from the pre-war practice of the company. In the era of prohibition, the prohibition law that was in force in the United States, the smuggling of alcohol was widespread. Whiskey and other spirits were shipped from Cuba and the Bahamas, among other places. The government decided to take action against prohibition violators, and Mr. Sotvan, president of Elco, received a large order to build fast boats for border and customs protection. At the same time, this distinguished gentleman also provided businessmen smugglers with boats. and thanks to the efforts of the chief designer of Elco Irwin Cheese, the violators of prohibition received boats faster than those built by order of the government, and even equipped with specially designed mufflers for engines and smoke equipment. Again, business is business. We have free enterprise in our country, N explained to me. The results of such free enterprise could be observed on a daily basis. Here, the Soviet embassy in Washington buys at auction a passenger car confiscated from some gangster gang that raided banks. It's a car with the most powerful engine, armored bullet body and bulletproof windows. I ask an American officer I know how it could have ended up with the gangsters. He replies obviously ordered it. Every free American, if he has dollars, can buy anything he needs. Maybe he's suffering from persecution mania. On April 26, 1944, the first of our intended big hunters arrived at the Miami Training Center from a shipyard in Texas. By this time, the brigade had already formed 16 crews from the arriving personnel. The management of all the big hunter divisions of the brigade had also been staffed. The division commanders Captain 3rd Rank Gritsuk, Captain 3rd Rank Nikolaev and Captain 3rd Rank Igorov were joined by deputies Sofronov, Sladko and Mikhailov, doctors Kvasov, Chakiryak and Kondybko and other specialists. The brig already had over 600 officers, petty officers and Red Fleet men. No sooner had the crew put the first hunter in order and begin testing than 4 more boats came to Miami. There was no doubt that in the terms agreed with us will arrive for acceptance and the remaining 27. I and our other officers were convinced of this, having visited many plants on the East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico. The scale of the deployed in the U.S. fleet construction was impressive. Thus, only to the construction of large hunters type SC-110 were involved more than 40 shipyards, which received orders for 800 boats. These shipyards before the war produced mainly peaceful products, pleasure boats, yachts. These small enterprises were able to develop serial production thanks to the system of cooperation of deliveries, unification of equipment, and so-called common things, maximum standardization. As a result, the work at the shipyards was reduced to the processes of assembling hulls from finished parts and installation of equipment and armament. I'd also like to point out that the work was strictly on schedule. Once, at John Trumpy's shipyard, there were 3 days left to load the engines on the boats on the slipway, and they had not yet arrived at the shipyard. I expressed concern about this, but Trumpy's son told me not to worry, the delivery deadline was tomorrow, and the engines would arrive no sooner or later. And he explained that the supplying company was on schedule with the transportation company. Indeed, the engines arrived on time. In early May 1944, we warmly bid farewell to Commander McDaniel, Capt. Harrison took command of the Submarine Fighter Training Center in Miami. He was an officer with combat experience, calm and benevolent. The experience of further cooperation confirmed the first favorable impression. During the month of May, the Soviet naval flag was hoisted by 6 big hunters. By the time they left for Mayport to prepare for the voyage across the Atlantic, our translators and officers had completed the work of translating technical documentation from English. It was reproduced on the rotator by our petty officers. Thus, all boats received descriptions of mechanisms and technical means and operational and combat instructions developed by the brigade headquarters. It was a big and very hard work. It was done by mechanical engineers M.N. Samoilov, N.M. Fomenko and V.N. Agafonov, Senior Lieutenant M.S. Sagilenko, and Major K. Sergeev. Especially difficult was Sagilenko and Sergeev, who translated from English technical documentation on hydroacoustic and radar equipment. After all, in those years, these technical means were the latest achievements of radio electronics. In June, the 1st Division of Big Hunter's 12 boats accepted by us in 1944 left to the USSR in August and September the 2nd of the same composition. They made the transition to the USSR in detachments of 6 units along the route Mayport-New York-St. John Londonderry Polanoye. It was approximately 5,800 miles, which the hunters travelled in 22 to 25 days. And unlike the 1943 crossings, the units went independently, not together with minesweepers. Of course, this required a number of additional measures to ensure a long voyage of the boats in the ocean, and even more thorough preparation. First of all, we decided to increase the stock of fuel and engine oil on each big hunter. For this purpose, one of the fresh water tanks was connected to the fuel system, and engine oil was also taken into additional tanks. It was allowed to use these excessive reserves only in case of necessity. If there was no need, fuel, and especially oil, would not be superfluous upon arrival to Pola. It is clear that the consumption of fresh water during the transition to the USSR had to be strictly limited. Water was released only for cooking and drinking tanks. To make the water diet a little easier, each boat received several cases of mineral water. In New York before departure, all the hunters underwent roll and stability determination. This important work was done under the direction of V.I. Pershing, a specialist of the Leningrad Shipbuilding Institute, who was on a business trip to the USA at that time. After that, it was possible to be sure that with skillful management the boats could withstand even a strong storm. The program of acceptance of large and small hunters and torpedo boats was successfully carried out. The personnel of the brigade was also replenished in June. 280 more sailors, petty officers and officers arrived from the USSR. Since May, I worked under the leadership of Rear Admiral A. Yakimov, who replaced M.I. Akulin, who returned to the USSR. On October 17th, A.A. Yakimov and I paid a visit to the commander of the Eastern Naval District, Vice Admiral Anderson, and thanked him for his assistance in the successful completion of ship deliveries for the Soviet Navy. A. Yakimov arranged a reciprocal reception, at which the Americans were presented with memorable gifts. The next day early in the morning I was informed about the approach of hurricanes, so called in the US, tropical storms. I immediately left for brigade headquarters. The car raced toward the port through deserted streets. The local radio station was urging residents to board up windows, stock up on candles, water and food. Fortunately, the hurricane, which had blown into Miami by midnight, had captured the city only by the edges. But wind speeds reached 40 meters per second. The wind tore off roofs, tore down power and telephone poles, ripped out tall royal palm trees. The sea level at the embankments rose rapidly, and soon the water flooded the streets and boulevards. Gone almost a meter into the water planking piers, at which stood our big hunters and in Miami and Key West. All night long, standing waist deep in the water, the crews kept the boats from hitting the pier walls. None of our big hunters sustained significant damage. Everything did not end so well, for the Americans' 2 hunters were stranded in Key West. In October, we sent the last big hunters to the USSR 10 boats. Thus, all 34 hunters of the 1944 plan were accepted. Besides, in the same year 50 torpedo boats and 16 small submarine hunters were delivered to our country from the USA. All the big hunters that came out of the US reached our bases in the Soviet Arctic Circle safely and became part of the Northern Fleet. On November 7th, I, together with my wife, was invited to Washington to the Soviet Embassy for a reception on the occasion of the 27th anniversary of the Great October Revolution. In several rooms in groups stood the invitees, on the tables a variety of drinks and appetizers. Waiters offered glasses with cocktails. Rear Admiral A. Yakimov introduced me to Andrei Andreevich Gromyko. The ambassador greeted me warmly and suggested that we go to one of the rooms to talk quietly. After we sat down in comfortable armchairs, the ambassador inquired about the progress of our work. A. Yakimov and I told Andrei Andreevich about the close completion of the program of acceptance of ships in 1944, about the organization of the transition of the units to the USSR, about the relationship with the Americans and our use of the network of training centers for the training of crews. I expressed confidence that the remaining boats, despite the winter storms and polar night, as successfully overcome the Atlantic and the Barents Sea, will come to the bases of the Soviet polar region, as well as the units that left earlier. It was not easier for the hunters in the 44th year to cross the Atlantic than in the 43rd. Here is how V. Drugov, a North Sea officer, in 1944 commander of the lead boat in the detachment of the 1st Division, which left New York on July 17th. Our detachment of 6 hunters under the command of Lieutenant Commander Konstantinov left St. John's on July 27, 1944, in fairly fresh weather. The forecast did not bode well. 2 days later, the wind speed had already reached 29 meters per second. That's a hurricane. A radiogram came from St. John advising us to return. However, the squadron commander, having questioned the opinion of the boat commanders by radio, decided to continue the movement. Because of the storm, the boats were travelling at a speed of 3 or 4 knots. The commanders tried to put the boats so that they would not be overturned by the huge waves. I remember well how in the huge raging ocean our small ships were thrown like splinters. They were buried in the waves up to the deckhouse, and the water was walking on the deck, sweeping away everything that was not firmly fixed. On my boat broke the mast of the radar antenna, ripped off their mountings 20mm machine gun. The sailors still managed to fix it, not to give it to the ocean. The broken mast of the radar antenna was also fixed with incredible difficulties. The personnel had to fight with water coming through the deckhouse doors and open bridge hatches. At last the storm began to subside, and for the first time during the whole time of the passage we had an opportunity to determine by the sun. It was off the coast of Ireland, after the boats had been sailing for 9 days. The unseaworthiness amounted to 2.5 miles. At Londonderry our detachment was given a literally triumphant welcome. When we entered the port, on all British, Canadian and American ships in this base, on the upper deck were lined crews. In this way the Allies expressed their respect and admiration for the Soviet sailors who had made the difficult crossing of the ocean. In the evening, at a reception given in our honour, the English Admiral, commander of the Londonderry Naval Base, expressed his admiration for the high naval qualities and courage of the Soviet sailors. From Ireland we moved to Lochue Base in Scotland and, after waiting for the approach of the detachment of Captain 3rd Rank I. N. Gritsuk, went out with the next convoy to the Soviet Union. On August 25, 1944, our 1st Division, consisting of 12 big hunters, arrived in Polyonoye. The boats of the other 2 divisions also met with no less difficulties during the transition to the polar region. It is impossible to list the names of all courageous Soviet sailors who overcame the Atlantic and the Barents Sea on small ships. I will name only the officers who commanded 6 detachments of hunters on crossings from the USA to the USSR. They were skillful, strong-willed commanders: Lieutenant Commander Konstantinov, Captain 3rd Rank Gritsuk, Senior Lieutenant Riss, Captain 3rd Rank Nikolaev, Senior Lieutenant Shokhnin and Captain 3rd Rank Igorov. All of them later took part in the battles for the liberation of Pechinga and northern Norway, the defeat of the Nazis in the polar region on the northernmost flank of the front of the Great Patriotic War. The year 1945 was approaching. Our armed forces were striking more and more powerful blows to Hitler's war machine, beating the enemy far beyond the borders of the motherland, liberating the peoples of Europe. But the power of Nazi Germany was still great. Imperialist Japan was so strong that, as it became known after the war, the American military command planned to land on its territory only in 1946. We realized that the enemy would fight to the end, that there would be fierce battles ahead. What would we here in the States do in the new year? We knew that we were to receive in New York for the first 5 months of the year 12 minesweepers of the UMAS type. It also became known that a large number of ships, including frigates, were expected to be transferred to the USSR on the western Pacific coast, as if in Seattle or Alaska. The experience gained by Soviet officers and petty officers in training during 2 years of hard work in receiving ships in the United States gave confidence that we would fulfill this task of the Soviet government successfully. The Soviet government highly appreciated our 2-year work in the USA. The officers and petty officers instructors who were part of the acceptance group and the crews of the ships were awarded orders and medals. On June 11th, I presented myself as commander of the Soviet naval unit to Rear Admiral Monroe, commander of the Gulf of Mexico Naval District, and Commander McDaniel, chief of the Submarine Fighter Training Center. The admiral and his staff promptly resolved all issues of life and training of Soviet sailors. Already on June 14th, our crews began training at the training center on the program agreed with me. 2 days earlier, P.A. Favorov left for Norfolk to participate in the passage from there to Miami of the first big hunter intended for transfer to the USSR. The training of our personnel at the training center in Miami was going well. By the time we arrived in Florida, This center already had extensive experience in training anti-submarine specialists. It had been established as early as March 1942. Since its organization, it was headed by Eugene McDaniel, who was well respected in the U.S. Navy as an excellent anti-submarine officer. The training process at the center was exceptionally intensive. According to the historian of the American Navy, S.E. Morrison, McDaniel had outstanding organizational and pedagogical abilities. With the help of several professional educators, he developed a program and methods of training specialists designed for intensive lectures and practical training. McDaniel selected instructors from officers who had personally participated in the fight against German submarines. The training period in the center, already trained in special schools crews, took only 7 days. Each week, 250 newcomers arrived, beginning the program on Monday. On Sunday, after passing their exams, they would leave on their ships for their home stations. This system of training allowed the center in Miami, by 1944, to prepare personnel to staff 1,088 ships. I must say that even after the end of training at the center, the former pets of McDaniel continued to keep in touch with him, asking for advice on anti-submarine warfare. Later, I had the opportunity to get acquainted with other training centers of the U.S. Navy. They trained officers and enlisted men in all ship specialties and provided the fleet with qualified replenishment. All centers were designed for a short period of training, as they actually conducted retraining officers, and enlisted men studied new technical means and weapons, mastered their combat use. The large submarine hunters we were to receive were designed and built by the Electric Boat Company. In World War I, this firm had built 550 small and 444 large submarine hunters for England in just a year and a half. With the outbreak of World War II, Elco resumed their construction on an improved design. The U.S. Navy Department, which needed such boats both for its fleet and for supplies to the British, attracted dozens of other large and small shipyards to build them. Thus, the SC-110 type big hunters were put into mass production. These boats had a displacement of 126 tons, wooden hull, 2 engines of 960 horsepower type pancake. They were armed with one 40mm Bofors cannon, 2 20mm Oerlikon machine guns, 2 rocket-propelled bombs and 2 bombs with 18 depth bombs. Such armament at a speed of 20 knots, a range of 1,800 miles and good hydroacoustic equipment made it possible to use them effectively against submarines. On June 26th, the first big hunter came to Miami from Norfolk, intended for transfer to our fleet. Favourov, who was on it at the transition to Miami, reported that the boat is seaworthy, well behaved on the wave. We immediately proceeded to its acceptance. At the same time, the crews worked hard on simulators in the classrooms and went to sea on large hunters belonging to the training center to practice ship control, use of technical means and weapons. We paid special attention in training to our hydroacoustic specialists' ears of the ship, as they say in the Navy. On June 13th, 1943, the solemn hoisting of the USSR Navy flag took place on the first big hunter handed over to us. On the pier, near where the boats stood, lined up American crews who were undergoing training in Miami. My speech, in which I thanked the representatives of the U.S. Navy for their help, and all the commands were transmitted over the radio broadcasting network of the training center. The commander of the training center, Commander McDaniel, also spoke. He praised the heroism of Soviet sailors shown in the defense of Odessa, Stalingrad and Sevastopol, and noted the courage and combat skill of Soviet crews of small anti-submarine ships operating in the harsh conditions of the Soviet polar regions. "I am happy," said McDaniel, "to hand over American ships to such wonderful warriors." In the evening, I invited McDaniel and several American officers to dinner, including Interpreter C, Peterson and a liaison officer assigned to our detachment. From our side were present P. A. Favourov T. N. Banin MNMNO, Samoylov, and the commander of the newly accepted Hunter NN Chistyakov. After supper, everyone moved to the parlour. Cigarette and cocktail disposed to casual conversation, and usually silent head of the training centre talked. I remember that he bitterly recounted how, in the first days after the entry of the United States into the war with Germany, when the U.S. Navy still did not have enough means to fight Hitler's submarines, They sank with impunity transports on the fairway going from Key West to Miami in front of the residents of the city and vacationers on the famous Miami beach. Somehow the Americans managed to sink Hitler's boat at shallow depths and raise it. In the dead, Hitler's officers found used tickets to Miami movie theaters and menu cards of local restaurants. The Germans visited them, landing on the Florida shore from their pirate ships. The commander cited a prime example of American carelessness. One of the American journalists in full uniform, Hitler's naval officer, all day wandered around the largest base of the U.S. Navy in Norfolk, through the streets of the city, spoke only in German, but no one paid attention to him. McDaniel also spoke about the fact that millions of Americans hate fascism and strive to contribute to its defeat. With great heartache, he recalled his friend who commanded a large pleasure boat, hastily adapted to detect Hitler's submarines. The boat went out to sea and did not return. The commander himself went in search of it. The boat was found it was bobbing on the wave without running. The whole crew was shot. The Hitlerites did not sink the boat, apparently for edification. I remembered that I saw its bullet-riddled hull on the wall at the building of the training center. It stood there exactly as a monument to the dead sailors. By the way, the famous American writer E. Hemingway searched for submarines on the same boat. Then the commander said that before his appointment to the training center commanded a destroyer. One day his ship was in the guard of a large convoy traveling to England. Hitler's boat sank the transport. The destroyer established hydroacoustic contact with the boat and bombed it, passing by people floating in the water from the sunken transport. The pirate was sunk, but the depth charges killed quite a few people. Still stands before my eyes the picture of that tragedy the commander finished. His voice trembled. Continuing our conversation, we unanimously agreed that Nazism must be destroyed once and for all. McDaniel said that after the victories of the Red Army at Moscow and Stalingrad, he has no doubts about the imminent defeat of Germany. And our conversation took place at a time when no American soldier has not yet fought in Europe, or even in North Africa, before the opening of the Second Front was still far away. But the commander believed in victory and believed that the decisive contribution to it was made by the Soviet Union. At the same time, he, like us, of course, was looking forward to the opening of the Second Front. Not all Americans were as optimistic as McDaniel. I'm not talking about politicians like Senator Truman. His position during the war is well known. But even so-called average Americans, too many, were in a hurry to make money in the war in the first place. I recall a conversation with an engineer at a shipyard in Miami. His reasoning about the war boiled down to the following. Since the Americans build ships for the USSR, supply weapons, etc., it is not clear why they should send American guys to war. So his son could work in a shipyard and earn dollars rather than go into the army. This man was deeply convinced that the USSR had no industry and produced nothing at all, and could fight only thanks to American aid. From this he concluded that the Americans would supply the Russians with weapons and they would fight the Nazis. But in general, the Americans treated Soviet people, Russians, as they called all of us, regardless of our nationality, very well. And military sailors, and our children and wives more than once had to hear words of admiration for the feat of our people. Our children, who went to school without knowing English, received special care at the American school in Miami. Teachers and school children helped our children to quickly get used to a new environment, to learn the language. I remember well how much attention and care was shown to my family by the owner of the cottage, Mrs. Kolos, the widow of a cabinet maker, a Belarusian by origin. It is true that some organs of the American state system gave a different attitude. During my and P.A. Favorov's long business trips, our families often went to visit each other, sometimes staying overnight. It happened that in the morning, when the wives returned to their cottage, they found traces of unknown guests' clothes in the closets and drawers of the tables were torn through, and even cigarette butts in some places. I had to ask McDaniel to tell people that visitors to our cottages should be more careful. After that, we either stopped being visited or the overnight guests began to behave more decently. While having a good and friendly attitude toward our country, Americans, with few exceptions, knew astonishingly little about it. Even the history of Russia in high school textbooks in those years was given only a few pages listing the Tsars. Not only did Americans know nothing about Russia's support for the Northerners during the American Civil War, but they were quite surprised when told about recent events, such as the US intervention in the Soviet Far East and the North, in Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The average American's understanding of the Soviet Union was truly anecdotal. Rarely did anyone not know the words samovar troika and vodka for many. This stockpile was the limit of knowledge about our country. More than once cab drivers asked me if we had cabs, and a barber asked me if our barber shops had such a sophisticated mechanism as a hair clipper. No wonder that at first the Americans were reluctant to allow our sailors and petty officers to disassemble the engines of the boats to adjust the complex equipment. But there were no extra parts after assembly, as the Americans feared. Then our allies went to the other extreme. A legend was born that all our sailors and petty officers were engineers in disguise. Strange as it may seem, such events as the flight to the United States through the North Pole, Ant 25V, P. Chakalov, G. Pichkalov, P. Chakalov, G.F. Bayev, Baidukov, and A.V. Belikov did not break the ingrained in the American public anecdotal perceptions of our country. But the fact that such a flight was no accident proved, and the subsequent flight to the US, M.M. Gromov. A lot was written about the Soviet pilots in the press. American pilots participated in the search for the plane of A.S. Levanovsky, which disappeared during the flight to America with a commercial cargo, the navigator of which was my classmate at the Frunze College, Viktor Levchenko. By the beginning of August we received and manned with Soviet crews 3 big hunters. The boats moved to Key West, to the moorings of the training center for training hydroacoustics and practicing attacks on submarines. Here the ship's anti-submarine crews were trained officers and hydroacoustics. This center was moved to Key West from London in 1940 and trained personnel for the Atlantic Fleet. In San Diego, California, a similar center trained specialists for the Pacific Fleet. Incoming hydroacousticians were subjected to rigorous musical tests, including hearing acuity and the ability to discern changes in volume and pitch. The center in Key West had well-equipped training rooms with simulators and sonars, which were used to train anti-submarine crews. Commander Keating, who commanded the center, had patrol ships and big hunters, 3 training submarines of the type Holland. This made it possible to carry out at sea to practice the actions and hydroacoustics and anti-submarine calculations in general. Arriving in Key West, our anti-submarine crews immediately joined the training process. On August 2nd, the Soviet naval attaché in the USI, A. Igoryshev, and his aide visited Miami. A. Igoryshev and his assistants Dorokov and Belyakov. Then we left for Key West and went to sea in the adopted boats, checked how our crews went out in training attacks on submarines. After that, all 3 hunters moved to Tampa, where they were placed at the disposal of Captain 3rd Rank M.N. Mole to prepare for the passage to the USSR together with the 3 trawlers just received. The attaché and his companions visited the minesweepers in Tampa. Seeing off A. Igoryshev, I asked to speed up the arrival of officers, petty officers and sailors from the USSR. We still did not have enough people to form crews. The accepted big hunters had only 1 officer instead of 3 and 20 petty officers and sailors instead of 30. In fact, the boats were to travel 5,000 miles from the US, port to the Soviet polar region, and stay at sea for at least 15 days. The situation with manning the crews of the next boats was even worse. The Americans began to talk about stopping the transfer of big hunters to us, as there were no crews for them. The attaché promised to inform Moscow immediately. After seeing the guests off, I left for Washington on August 19th. After reporting to M.I. Akulin about the current situation, we decided that we would have to disband the crew of one of the minesweepers under construction. This will at least to some extent diffuse the situation and allow to send crews to the big hunters. Then I visited Annapolis, where boats of Vosper type were built for the USSR under English license. All boats of this type were supplied to the English Navy and partly to us. In England, Vosper began to be built in the pre-war years by the firm Power Boot, on the project of the designer Scott Payne. These were seaworthy boats with displacement of 45 tons, with a wooden semi-glycerine hull and 3 engines of 1,150 horsepower, which allowed to develop speed up to 42 knots. They were armed with two 533mm torpedo tubes, one 20mm machine gun, and two twin mounts of large-caliber machine guns. On the Vopra, as well as on the boats adopted by the U.S. Navy, had radar stations, radars, as the Americans and British called them. However, radars were removed from torpedo boats and big hunters transferred to the USSR. It was more than difficult to understand such actions of the Allies. After all, at that time radar stations were already available in Hitler's fleet. Only since 1944, the Americans began to supply us with boats with radar stations. Back in Miami, I escorted the first group of ships to New York, 3 minesweepers and 3 big hunters. Division Commander MMN Bull commanded the passage. Further on the passage from New York to the Soviet polar region, the detachment was commanded by N.S. Dibelov. In the first days of September, the second group of the same composition was planned to go to New York. I was not going to participate in it. But on September 6th in Miami came a telephonogram from M.I. Arkolin, which ordered me to leave urgently to Key West and take part in the transition to New York of the second group of ships. Arriving in Key West and talking on the phone with Washington, I realized the reason for my summons to Key West. It turns out that the commander of the Minesweeper Division, Mikhail Nikolaevich Mol, having brought the group of ships to New York, reported to M.I. Arkolin that the transfer of large hunters from the US to the USSR is impossible. He referred to his conversations with officers of the American fleet, who assured that the passage of big hunters across the Atlantic is extremely risky, and therefore they transport their boats across the oceans to Europe and Australia on board of transports. Indeed, to Europe, the Americans sent boats on board transports, dry cargoes and tankers, so began to do after the storm, on the way from the US to North Africa, killed 6 of the 8 crossing the Atlantic big hunters for submarines. But at the same time, their torpedo boats were making 1,000-mile crossings from bases on the US West Coast to islands in the South Pacific. Back in 1941, General MacArthur passed on the torpedo boat Lieutenant Commander Bulkley from Manila to Australia, and a year later torpedo boats made a passage of 1,700 miles from Pearl Harbor to Midway Island. Big hunters also made crossings to New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. I was told about my own experience of long ocean passages by familiar American officers, the assistant chief of the training center in Miami Beasley and the former commander of the torpedo boat division, operating near the Solomon Islands, Montgomery. The question of the possibility of transition of large hunters on their own across the Atlantic was of exceptional importance also because the delivery of these boats on board of transports and tankers would reduce the tonnage of cargoes delivered to the USSR. Thus it was necessary to prove in practice that the big hunters were seaworthy, capable of sailing in storms, and could sail to the USSR.